Thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and of course, thanks to Paul for inviting me. I've been coming to Belfast for a long time now, since about 1988, 89 or so. I came first not chasing democratic innovations, but more romantic innovations. That was a long time ago, but still, don't tell my wife. But anyway, yeah, and I lived here for 4 years. I did a PhD at Queen's. So, I mean, it's a great part of the world. I love coming back here. And I've always been very, very impressed by the sheer amount of, well, I guess the kind of vibrancy of the community sector here. It's absolutely fantastic. I've never seen anything like it. So, as I say, it's a real pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to talk to you today about deliberative democracy in deeply divided societies. I guess I should say I've used the phrase democratic innovation already, and Andrew has used the word civic innovation. We've heard about and things of that sort. But often hovering in the background of these ideas, about the idea that people should be more involved in politics, that people should have a voice, there is a theory floating in the background, and that theory is deliberative democracy. Now, people have been writing about this theory for a long time, 30, 40 years. In fact, some people trace it right back to the ancient Greeks. So it's been around a long, long time. There's a huge body of literature on it now. And I should say there's also lots of internal divisions, lots of internal debates about what it is or how it should best be conceptualised. Well, obviously we don't have time to talk too much about that today, but I hope to give you a flavour of what it is. I should say that I came at this initially as a political theorist, or if you like, a political philosopher. So I was interested in kind of the sorts of democratic values, things like equality, inclusion, civility, and what these might mean if they were cast within a kind of a deliberative framework. What would they mean? Now, over the years, I've become much more applied in my work, so it wasn't just about thinking about what the ideas or the values meant, but how they could be instituted, how they could be operationalised, what they would mean in practice, could they make a difference? And I do this with respect to deeply divided societies, places like, I guess, Northern Ireland, obviously, but other places like Bosnia and Lebanon and Iraq and so on. I mean, it is strange when I teach my students in Newcastle University how unaware they actually are of deeply divided societies. It's like they don't exist. And yet, if you look at a map, you'll see that deep divisions are, well, they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're all over the globe. So what, if anything, can deliberative democracy say about these kind of things? First of all, just a few general, brief comments about what deliberative democracy is. Well, it's a form of democracy that emphasises the importance of taking decisions on their merits. Okay? And to that end, it stresses the idea of actually giving reasons for your views, for the policies that you would like to see implemented, and very often for the policies you would like to see implemented upon other people. So the basic idea is if you're going to push something on other people, you should be able to give them a reason or justification that in some sense they could actually find acceptable, instead of just forcing your views, whatever they might think about them, on them. So it's not about numbers. Again, I think it was Andrew or Paul said it. It's not just about voting. It's not just about having the biggest amount of numbers on your side. It's about having the best arguments. As part of that, of course, best arguments just don't emerge. You can't just pick them off trees. We have to create conditions that will allow the best arguments to emerge and to be tested against the best arguments on the other side, so that people have an opportunity to arrive at a considered judgment about what they think it should be. So it's about weighing the reasons for and against different policy proposals. That's what it's about at an abstract level. And then in a more applied sense, it's about what are the conditions that might allow that to happen. And of course, today is actually about creating those conditions. That's what you're doing here today. It's about creating conditions that might allow deliberative democracy to flourish. So that's what we're doing today. It sounds very abstract, but it's real, and we know that because we're here. Now, it also supposes, of course, that people will listen with an open mind to what other people have to say. There is no point whatsoever in deliberating unless you're open-minded. Of course, when people turn up, they think they've got it. They've got the best arguments. That's fine. But if you go into a deliberative setting with a closed mind, you're not doing deliberation. You're not engaged in democratic innovation. You must be open-minded. That doesn't mean you have to change your mind, but it does mean that you must at least be receptive to what other people have to say, and you must be prepared to make your views responsive to what they have to say. So that's what it is in very broad brushstroke terms. That's what the theory of deliberative democracy says. And of course, a John McEnroe moment. I mean, you can't be serious. Are you crazy that we could do this kind of stuff in a deeply divided society? Well, I hope I can convince you that maybe it's possible. So what do I mean by deeply divided society? Well, I really don't need to explain this to you in this room, but roughly I mean a society in which at least one major segment or community has fundamental doubts about the legitimacy of the state. The state itself is in question. All societies are divided to one extent or another. But, if you're living in a multicultural society, new groups, immigrant groups might be trying to find their way, but they don't necessarily say, well, this state shouldn't continue to exist in its present format. So they are different. Deeply divided societies are a special category. What we get in these societies is a lot of social segregation, and very often social segregation is bad for deliberation, because many people in divided societies can go their entire lives without ever having a serious conversation with somebody from the other side. So there may be deliberation, but it often takes place within, as they put it in the literature, within enclaves. You get enclave deliberation. The difficulty with that is if you only speak with like-minded others, this is what the evidence, we know this from lots of experiments in social psychology and evidence in social psychology, people become more extreme in their views. Wherever you start, whatever the direction of travel is in your group, you will become more extreme in that direction. So enclave deliberation can be highly polarizing. So in that sense, deliberation is not a panacea. It's not a case of any deliberation at all will do. It must be deliberation under the right conditions. Otherwise, deliberation may simply make things worse. Now, for a long, long time, right back as far as Plato, actually, people have argued that deliberation is a nonsense. Ordinary people like you and me, we're just not reflective enough. We're not just informed enough to make considered judgments. And for that reason, it should be left to elites. It should just be left to politicians. Ordinary people make political decisions. Are you mad? Ordinary people just want to lead their lives. They're not really interested in thinking and reflecting and listening to arguments with an open mind. Well, there's certainly some truth in that. That can't be denied, of course. But a very important thing that people often miss about deliberation, this is a quotation from arguably the first and most important, or one of the very first essays on deliberative democracy. A guy called Joshua Cohn laid out what he thought it was in 1989. It's a very, very important essay when he tried to advance. People were fed up of, I guess, what people call vote-centric democracy, where people just voted. Leave it to elites. You vote every 4 years. If you don't like it, you can vote the rascals out. If you do like it, you can vote them back in again. People were getting fed up with this, really, in the 80s. And Cohn wrote a very, very important essay about it. And he said something, I think, that often, I don't think this quote actually gets enough attention, but it is a very important one. He said, neither the commitment to nor the capacity for arriving at deliberative decisions is something that we can simply assume to obtain independent from the proper ordering of institutions. Now we think of institutions like this. But remember, something like the Community Foundation is an institution. Institutions come in all shapes and forms, so I wouldn't read too much into the word institution there in terms of these big governmental institutions. He says the institutions determine whether there is equality, whether deliberation is free and reasoned, whether there is autonomy and so on. Deliberation doesn't happen spontaneously. Civic innovation doesn't happen spontaneously. You need an institutional base to support it. It's extremely important. Now, I should say that a lot of work has been done on the prospects for deliberation, and again, it's a terrible word to use, but you know what I mean, in normal democratic societies. Much less, however, has been done in deeply divided societies. I mean, obviously, if you're here today, you might think there's an awful lot of this stuff going on in deeply divided societies, but if you leave Northern Ireland, there really isn't an awful lot. Even within academic circles, there are very, very few people researching the prospects for deliberative democracy in divided societies. That's a real problem for the reason I said earlier on, which is that divided societies are everywhere. So, what would you do? What would a proper institutional basis look like for deliberative democracy? In my own work, I've focused a lot on reforming places like this, actually, kind of top-down big governmental institutions. Because I think it can't just be bottom-up. You've got to change the top as well. How do you do it? Well, effectively, you have to change the incentives that you give to politicians. You have to encourage, or perhaps even better, you have to oblige them to behave better. You have to oblige politicians to behave in a more deliberative fashion. Because if they're not going to meet halfway, the problem is they may ignore us. How would you do that? How would you change institutions? Well, I mean, there's some very good things about the Belfast Agreement from a deliberative perspective, but there's some things that are, and the St Andrews Agreement, some things are a bit more worrying. For example, the process by which the First Minister and Deputy First Minister are appointed, it's automatic. They have no reason to talk to one another. It's all about just winning the biggest share of the vote. You do that very often, not by presenting yourself as a moderate, someone who's actually willing to work with the other side. You do it by presenting yourself as a tough guy. Yeah, somebody I can stand up for the community. I can do this. The problem is that's polarizing. How are you going to moderate afterwards when you get returned to power? This is a real major problem for societies of this sort. Polarization caused because of the outbidding behavior of politicians. They literally outbid. It's like a bidding war. Who can be the toughest representative of the community? That's great. It gets you elected, but then you've got to govern. And well, obviously I don't need to explain how that goes. So the problem is that without moderation, deliberation is unlikely to flourish. People must be moderate in their views. I said a while ago they must be open-minded. That's just another way of saying they must be moderate. There have, of course, been some positive developments. I mean, it was Chris who mentioned the Civic Assembly. I thought he put a very positive gloss on that. These are possibilities. He made it sound like it was actually going to happen. But anyway, there is another thing that I think is quite important, actually, and this is the reform of the petition of concern. It does seem as if a justificatory clause has been inserted into this, and there is a reference to things like the European Convention on Human Rights. And this, I think, does point towards a more principled form of politics that I think coheres well with deliberative democracy. It's early days, we have to see how that goes. But I think so there are some good things here, some reasons to be optimistic, but we need to keep an eye on it, basically. That's institutions. What about deliberation in the broader public sphere, amongst ordinary people as opposed to elites? What's going on here? What are the prospects? Well, way back in 2007, we conducted a deliberative poll. Some people regard deliberative polling is a form of democratic innovation. We hear a lot about civic assembly or citizen assemblies nowadays and citizen juries and these kind of things. But in a way, the kind of forerunner of these was the deliberative poll, and some people still regard deliberative polls as the gold standard. So we ran one in Oma, actually, on education reform way back in 2007. And a key finding from this was that, well, Catholics came to see, these were the Catholic members of the sample, they came to see Protestants as more open to reason, great, and more trustworthy, and Protestants came to see Catholics as more open to reason. These were statistically significant results. This mattered. This suggested that if you could replicate this experiment in a broader society, you would see similar kinds of developments. Belgium in 2010 in a pair of deliberative mini-publics, deliberative democratic innovations. Interestingly, deliberation was actually higher in the mixed groups, in the linguistically mixed groups. That's, Belgium is divided along linguistic lines between Dutch speakers and French speakers. You might find it hard to believe, but actually the mixed groups displayed higher deliberative quality than the kind of monological or monolinguistic groups. Of course, that has to do with something you're probably all used to thinking about as well. Diversity probably drove those kinds of changes. It's really important. It goes back to what I was saying a while ago about enclave deliberation. People only talk about themselves. Nothing much happens other than becoming more polarized. Diversity matters hugely in these kind of setups. We ran an event, actually. This may sound this may sound a bit kind of mad, but we ran one of these events in Kirkuk, actually. Kirkuk is a very, very deeply divided, war-torn city in the north of Iraq. It's highly contested between Arabs, Kurds and Turkmens, and we did this with university students at the University of Kirkuk. It's just too difficult to do this kind of work outside of that kind of setting. And what was interesting about it, well, the rhetoric of politicians in Kirkuk is all about, Kirkuk is our Jerusalem. Everybody claims it as their Jerusalem. They use that kind of language. But the fact of the matter is, ordinary young Kirkukis, what do they want? They just want self-governance, and they want it on an equal basis. It's really quite incredible. And the case of the Turkmens, one of the three main ethnic groups, they came to actually want it significantly more than they did before they began this process. It's not, it's not all good news. Some experiments in Colombia between former paramilitaries and FARC guerrillas and the host communities that they've been inserted into, that didn't go terribly well. Now, why that is, there's going to be variation from case to case. I suspect it's because they were inserted in and they were paid to be there as part of the reintegration process. Ex-paramilitaries and FARC guerrillas are paid actually to do this kind of thing. It's not necessarily the best setting for it. So some concluding thoughts. So some concluding thoughts. So I think the deliberation is possible, even in some of the more extreme, deeply divided societies. In place I've mentioned Kirkuk. It is possible to do it, but only if you create the right conditions. As part of those conditions, I think it's something I'm sure it's going to come up again today. Random sampling is extremely important. You don't want just deliberation among like-minded people. They will deliberate, but it's not the kind of deliberation we're after because you'll end up with polarisation. It's likely to make things worse. Publicity is also likely to be very, very important. So, for example, the deliberative poll that I mentioned on education reform that we ran in 2007, that became a Hearts and Minds special here on BBC Northern Ireland. It was a feature in the New York Times and in the Financial Times here. So it got a lot of publicity. The reason why that's important is because, we're just a tiny group of people here, but we've got to get the message out. An obvious way of doing that is, this publicity principle, which is very important in representative institutions, but I think also for deliberative democracies. Well, film it, broadcast it, tweet about it, talk about it. It's really important for people, insofar as we can at all, to see that this can be done. It's important to show that ordinary people can meaningfully deliberate and arrive at decisions, actually, again, we're finding this in the evidence that's emerging, that are good for everybody in society, not just their own community. One of the reasons, this is something I would like to chase up over the coming years, the more we do this is my hunch, call it a hypothesis, but a hunch will do fine. My hunch is the more we can get the message out, the more we can do this kind of work, the more difficult it is for politicians to participate in outbidding. Let's change the culture within which politicians operate. They outbid because there's nobody to hold them to account. There's nobody to say, well, this isn't the kind of politics we want. There's nobody to say, well, we can imagine a different politics. We've seen a different politics. We've engaged in a different politics. Stop what you're doing. Stop outbidding. Stop playing the ethnic card. Give us a kind of different politics. But this depends on all the things I've been talking about. Innovative design, publicity, and so on. So it's all these kinds of things. So it's about getting politicians to pay attention. So I said about top-down, bottom-up at the beginning. It's both. It can't just be about us. We must oblige them to take a different kind of politics seriously. So actually, I'll leave it at that then. Thank you very much.